to Asians or Asian Americans and to give them to white actors. This has been happening since the very beginning of Hollywood. I was mad enough that I decided to do a webcomic about it. I did a webcomic talking about why I wasn't going to go see the live action movie, and to this day I have not seen it. I wanted people to boycott it. And out of all the things that I've ever done on the internet, this got by far the biggest reaction. I had hundreds and hundreds of responses to this. A lot of people agreed with me, a lot of people did not. Most people were very polite, but it is the internet, so there were some not so polite people. Now, of all the people who disagreed with me, I think the most compelling argument that they made was this. They said that, you know, these cultures are fantasy cultures. They're fantasy cultures. And, like, if you take the Water Tribe, for example, which is based on Inuit culture, the Water Tribe, they all have blue eyes, you know? They all have blue eyes, so why can't a white actress play a character with blue eyes? Well, I thought about this. Here's my answer to that. You know, like all good fantasy, Avatar: The Last Airbender takes real-world elements and gives them a fantastic spin, a mythological spin. So for instance, like Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien based Lord of the Rings on England. He wanted to create an English mythology. So the Hobbits are really based on the English folks that he grew up around, you know, and the Shire is based on like where he's from. So if you look at the Hobbits and you look at their culture and the way they look, they're very English. They're very, very English. But what keeps this from being straight, you know, a straight autobiographical story for J.R.R. Tolkien is that there are fantasy elements. So for the Hobbits, it's their height, and it's also their hairy feet. Those hairy feet are there to remind us that we're in a fantasy world. That's based on real-world elements. I think that's what these eye colors are for. You know, all the folks in the Water Tribe have blue eyes. All the folks in the Earth Kingdom have green eyes. In the Fire Nation, they have yellow eyes, and in the Air Nation, they have gray eyes. I think this is a fantasy element to remind us of the fact that we're in a fantasy world. This isn't, they didn't pull the blue eyes from any real world culture. And I think that the fact that the Fire Nation have yellow eyes is really indicative of this, right? Nobody has naturally yellow eyes in the real world. So eye color is a fantasy element. Lots of folks read that webcomic. One of the folks that read the webcomic was an editor who works at Dark Horse Comics. At the end of 2010, she emailed me and she told me that first she had read some of my other comics and she really liked them. And second, from that webcomic, she knew that I was really familiar and a fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender. She told me about the Airbender books that they already had going. And she also told me about this brand new series that would bridge the gap between the two animated series. She asked me if I'd be willing to do this. She told me a little bit about The Legend of Korra, which debuts this month. And because I'm such a huge fan of the original series, I of course said yes. Now, this was very difficult to write. The story was very, very difficult to write. At the very end of the original animated series, the Fire Nation, which is the aggressive nation of the four, you know, it's based on Meiji-era Japan, so it has that sort of imperialist mentality towards the rest of the world. At the very end of the series, the Fire Nation is defeated. Aang defeats the Fire Lord, the leader of the Fire Nation. And then the world is restored to peace. So because the world's at peace, I was like, man, what kind of a story am I going to tell? Well, what I did was I decided to look at Japanese history, and I decided to look at what happened to Japan after World War II, after they were defeated. One of the major areas of strife for Japan after World War II was in their colonies. They had colonies in Taiwan and in Korea and in China. And these colonies were forced to disband. So folks who had been living there for, in some cases, a couple of generations were forced to leave. I did the exact same thing in my story. So the Fire Nation colonies, these Fire Nation colonies are forced to disband and leave. And then Aang and the new Fire Lord, who's a good guy named Zuko, and the Earth King, who's the head of the Earth Kingdom, they get together and they create this program called the Harmony Restoration Movement, which moves all of these Fire Nation colonies out. The Harmony Restoration Movement, that name is, I use because in the late 1800s, movements were a big thing with the Chinese government. They had like the self-strengthening movement and the May 4th movement. They're all about movements. Most of my story takes place in a town called Yudao. It's a Fire Nation colony in the Earth Kingdom. This name Yu Dao is one of the few names in the book that I thought of in Chinese first. My Chinese isn't very good, even though I went to Chinese school for 12 years. I didn't do my homework. My mom told me I would regret it, and she was totally right. But I knew enough to do this. So Yu Dao, the first character, Yu, means jade. The reason I chose that was that jade is usually green, and green is also the national color of the Earth Kingdom. So I wanted something in the name to indicate that this was natively an Earth Kingdom town, right? It's a colony. The Dao is Dao, which means island, but the city itself is not an island. I got this character, this Chinese character, from the city of Qingdao. Qingdao, this is the second character of Qingdao. Qingdao is also not an island. It's a Chinese city. It's a port city, and it has a history of colonialism. It was first a German colony and then a Japanese colony. And in fact, its major export still speaks to its colonial past. Qingdao is most well known for the beer Qingdao. When I looked at the story, I thought, man, you know, the easiest way to write the story would be to do an Avatar version of Once Upon a Time in China, like a Jet Li movie. So the Avatar teams up with some Earth Kingdom friends and they kick the Fire Nation out, kind of like how Jet Li teams up with a bunch of other Chinese and they kick the Europeans out. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a Once Upon a Time in Earth Kingdom. But unfortunately, there are a couple of things that prevented me from doing this. First, when we go from the first animated series to the new one, the world has really changed. It's gone from a world where the four nations live separately to one where they are actually living side by side in these multicultural cities. Okay, and the way we get from point A to point B is actually through these Earth Kingdom colonies, these Fire Nation colonies. So within the established history, established by the folks who work on the show, this is already the case. Second is, I think that colonialism is really bad, right? It's a bad thing. But it also is a very complex thing. Even though it's generally not good, there are some good things that can come out of it. I have a hero named Liu Xiaobo. He's a Nobel Prize laureate. He's a Chinese poet, not a Chinese poem, a Chinese poet and a political dissident. He's currently serving a jail sentence in China for violating some of their anti-free speech laws. So I admire him, but he said something very, very controversial about colonialism. When he was asked what it would take for China to embrace Western values like free speech, he said this. He said, it would take 300 years of colonialism. In 100 years of colonialism, Hong Kong has changed to what we see today. With China being so big, of course it would require 300 years of colony for it to be able to transform into how Hong Kong is today. I have my doubts as to whether 300 years would be enough. This is a very hard thing, right? It's a very hard thing to hear from like a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, that he wants his native country to become a colony of another power. And when he was interviewed later, he admitted that this was a very radical thing to say, and maybe he exaggerated a little bit too much. But what it does point to is the fact that there is some value to cultures coming together, even a very powerful culture with a smaller culture. Even in those cases where there's a tendency for the powerful culture to do something really bad to the smaller culture, there can be things of value that emerge from that. So colonialism is an incredibly complex thing. I tried to play with these dynamics as best I could in this kid's comic, but that's what made it difficult to write. The art is not done by me. The art is done by this Japanese art team, Numguri-Huru. They're amazing. There are two ladies who live in Japan. They've done some work for Marvel Comics. But for our book, I think they've pulled out all the stops. They've really created some really amazing looking art. If you flip through the book, you'll see. This is some of the best stuff I've ever seen them do. So the first book is out already. The second book will be out in May. And then the last book will be out at the very end of the year. That's it. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. Are there any questions that I can answer for anybody? And if there are questions that you can think of, that you think of later on today, you can email me. Any questions I can answer? No?